Hi again. This video is going to be about how the blood moves through the heart. So it's easiest when we're starting to make a schematic of the heart instead of trying to understand the blood flow through the heart using an anatomically correct diagram. So we're going to start by drawing the four chambers. Remember that the right is actually on the left and the left on the right because we're doing this in anatomical position. And we're going to label the chambers. The top ones that are going to receive the blood and act as booster pumps are the right and left atrium. The bottom ones, the main pumps of the heart, are the right and left ventricles. Now, we can start this process anywhere that we want because the blood flows in a complete circuit. In other words, it always comes back to the place where it started. Now, I'm going to begin in the left atrium. As the blood moves from the left atrium to the left ventricle, it passes through the left atrioventricular valve, also known as the bicuspid, also known as the mitral valve. The left ventricle then sends the blood into the aorta, the main artery here, through the aortic semilunar valve, and that blood is headed to the body, both the upper and the lower body, but we're just going to say body here. In the body, the blood delivers oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide, and then it returns to the heart through the vena cava, and it ends up in the right atrium. It moves from the right atrium to the right ventricle, passing through the right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve. Then the right ventricle contracts and sends the blood, cannot find a good place for my screen here, sends the oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. It passes through the pulmonary semilunar valve in order to get there. In the lungs, the gas is exchanged. Blood gives up the carbon dioxide and picks up oxygen. And then that oxygen-rich blood returns back to where we started in the left atrium. Now, remember what I said in the first video, which is that the vessels that are carrying blood away from the heart are the arteries. So this is the aorta. And this is the pulmonary artery, or the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. The vessels that are bringing blood back to the heart are veins. For those of you that speak Spanish or similar languages, you can remember volver, which is to return, and veins both start with V. Now, there's another way to look at the blood flow through the heart. Actually, there are lots of ways to look at the blood flow through the heart. We're going to, in this case, split the two sides of the heart apart because that helps us to see the full circle. Once again, we'll start in the left atrium. Blood goes from the left atrium to the left ventricle through the left AV valve, bicuspid, or mitral. Then it leaves the left ventricle into the aorta, going through the aortic semilunar valve, and that blood is carried to the body to deliver oxygen and pick up CO2. It now travels back to the heart, but to the other side of the heart in the vena cava, and it goes into the right atrium. Now, why do I have this part of the heart upside down? Because we always go from atrium to ventricle. The reason that the previous diagram may have looked confusing is actually because we had to twist it to get everything to be right side up like it is in the body. Here, we're not worried about it being anatomically correct at all, but we never go from ventricle to atrium. It's always atrium to ventricle. So we go from the right atrium to the right ventricle through the right AV valve or the tricuspid valve. Then the right ventricle sends the blood into the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries through the pulmonary semilunar valve. That blood goes to the lungs, picks up oxygen, drops off CO2, and then returns back to the left atrium where it will eventually get sent to the ventricle, out to the body to deliver. So the blood is making this constant circuit. where it is being sent like a delivery truck to pick up the goods that it needs to deliver in the lungs. And then once the delivery truck is filled, then it gets sent out to make the delivery. And it goes around and around, picking up oxygen, dropping oxygen off. And each one of those trips is powered by a different side of the heart. Now, in this diagram, it's particularly easy to see what we call the circuits. So we divide the circulatory system into two circuits or two loops that the blood makes. One is the right side of the heart going to the lungs and then back to the heart, even though it's to the other side. This is called the pulmonary circuit. The left side of the heart sends blood to the body, and then that comes back to the heart, granted to the other side, and this is the systemic circuit. Systemic means the rest of the systems of the body that aren't pulmonary. Now, here we can label the vessels in a general sort of way. So the vessels of the pulmonary circuit are known as the pulmonary arteries, the ones that are going away from the heart. And then the pulmonary veins are carrying blood from the lungs back to the heart. These are the systemic arteries and the systemic veins. Now, this is a picture of a real human heart. And if you'll notice, the walls of the ventricles are not the same thickness. So it makes one wonder, why is one ventricle so much thicker than the other? And the reason is that the right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs right next door, right? We don't even have to travel very far, so it doesn't require a lot of pressure. The left ventricle, on the other hand, pumps blood to the entire body. Has to get blood to the head, it has to get blood to the arms, it has to get blood to all the organs, it has to get blood to your legs. And because of that, it needs to be able to pump with much greater force, with much greater pressure. And to do that, it has to have more muscle, more strength. So the left side, or the left ventricle, has a much thicker wall than the right ventricle. Okay, let's take a look at how the blood moves through the heart based on what we've looked so far. This time we're going to use a more anatomically correct heart. Now, let's get our orientation first. This is our right ventricle, right atrium, left ventricle, left atrium. Here's the aortic semilunar valve going into the aorta. Here's the pulmonary semilunar valve going into the pulmonary trunk and then the pulmonary arteries. All right, so we're going to start with blood that has just dropped off as oxygen in the body, in the upper body and in the lower body. Those are both carried back to the right atrium. The blood from the upper body came back through the superior vena cava. The blood from the lower body came back through the inferior vena cava. Now, that blood moves through the right AV valve, or the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts. The blood passes through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries out to the lungs. Here, it exchanges carbon dioxide for oxygen, so now it's oxygen rich. It returns to the heart, this time through the pulmonary veins, into the left atrium. It then moves through the left AV or bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. And when the ventricle contracts, it moves through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta and goes about delivering its oxygen to the various parts of the body. So we're back where we started. Now, in reality, both sides of the heart contract at the same time. So let's look at how that might appear. So we have oxygen-rich blood that's just leaving the lungs, oxygen-poor blood that's just coming back from the body. All of that blood goes into the atria, depending on which side it's going to, and from there to the ventricles. Now, both ventricles contract simultaneously, sending the blood into the arteries. The ones going into the pulmonary arteries go out to the lungs. The ones going into the systemic arteries go out to the body. Gas is exchanged. The blood returns to the atria, goes into the ventricles, out through the arteries, does its gas exchange, and then returns to the body.